Yes, there it is for anybody who wants to follow along. So, where we left off was with neo-Nazis committing a massacre in Odessa, killing over 40 leftists who had ran into a trade union building for safety during a peaceful kind of protest concert in the park that they had been doing when a group of Nazis showed up who were affiliated with the Ukrainian government, chased them into a trade union building. The building, they lit it on fire, and 40 people died in that fire. So that's where we left off. And now we're going to pick up with a McLeod piece, Alan McLeod piece from Mint Press News, which is a left-wing political source. Some people will tell you they don't like this source because it's overtly left-wing, but I'm left-wing, so I like it. That's fine. But we read from a lot of different sources. We have some right-wing sources, some centrist sources, some left-wing sources, etc. We're going to start with the left-wing one. So this is by Alan McLeod, who has his doctorate in sociology from the University of Glasgow, and his emphasis is in Venezuela and propaganda and how propaganda influences public opinion, but he deals with all geopolitics as well. Why? Why not going up to my vibes? Why? What do you mean? Are my vibes bad? My vibes are bad today. I have bad vibes today, chat. Okay, let's get into it. It's going to make me sadder? Yeah, it is. That's true. That's so true. Okay, it is depressing. All right, so Washington. All right, let's get a date on this before we go. So McLeod usually writes academic texts, but I like his reporting for Mint Press News. I don't have the date immediately available because it's written in popular speak. It's very, very easy to understand, and also it includes the links, just all his hyperlinks, etc. in here, so it's very, very nice. Amid tough talk from European and American leaders, a new Mint Press study of our nation's most influential media outlets reveals that it is the press that is driving the charge towards war with Russia over Ukraine. 90% of recent opinion articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal have taken a hawkish view on conflict, with anti-war voices few and far between. Opinion columns have overwhelmingly expressed support for sending U.S. weapons and troops to the region. Russia has universally been presented as the aggressor in this dispute, with media glossing over NATO's role in amping tensions while barely mentioning the U.S. collaboration with neo-Nazi elements within the Ukrainian ruling coalition. Western media and governments have expressed alarm over a suspected buildup of Russian military forces close to the over 1,200-mile border with Ukraine. There are reportedly almost 100,000 troops in that vicinity, causing President Joe Biden to warn that this is the most consequential thing that's happened in the world in terms of war and peace since World War II. Now, this is before the war actually broke out. Yet this is far from the first media panic over a supposedly imminent Russian invasion. In fact, warning of a hot war in Europe is nearly a yearly occurrence at this point. In 2015, outlets such as Reuters, the New York Times claimed that Russia was amassing troops and heavy firepower, including tanks, artillery, and rocket launchers right on the border, while normally sleepy frontier towns were abuzz with activity. In 2016, there was an even bigger meltdown, with media across the board predicting that war was around the corner. And remember, this is because all of this conflict between the ethnic Russians, minorities in Ukraine wanting to secede and join Russia, etc., it started in 2014. So this is these years where this has led up to this. Indeed, The Guardian reported that Russia would soon have 330,000 soldiers on the border. When the next spring came, there were renewed warnings of conflict. The Wall Street Journal claimed that tens of thousands of soldiers were being deployed to the border. The New York Times upped the figure to as many as 100,000. A few months later, U.S. News said that thousands of tanks were joining them. So what do we take from this? What's the important thing to take from this? This was not an unprovoked attack. This was not out of nowhere. And Ukraine and the United States had multiple years to attempt to negotiate this issue with Russia, and they plainly chose not to. Late 2018, New York Times, other media, up in arms over a fresh Russian buildup, this time of 80,000 military units. And in the spring of last year, it was widely reported, for instance, by Reuters and the New York Times, that Russia had amassed armies totaling over well over 100,000 units on Ukraine's border, signaling the war was imminent. Therefore, there were actually considerably fewer Russian units on Ukraine's border than there were even 11 months ago, according to Western numbers. Furthermore, they are matched by a force of 250,000 Ukrainian troops on the other side. Right? So there's 250,000 Ukrainian troops on the other side of the border. Nobody talks about that. Thus, many readers will be forgiven for thinking it is Groundhog Day again, yet there is something different about this time. Coverage over the conflict has been enormous and has come to dominate the news cycle for weeks now in a way it simply did not previously. The possibility of war has scared Americans and provoked calls for a higher military budget and a redesign of American foreign policy to counter this supposed threat. Russia, for its part, has repeatedly rejected all allegations that it plans to attack Ukraine, describing them as fiction. Talks about the coming war are provocative by themselves. The U.S. seems to be calling for this, wanting and waiting for this war to happen, as if you want to make your speculations come true, said Russia's ambassador to the UN. Perhaps more surprisingly, the Ukrainian government appears to agree, recognizing that any conflict would prove devastating to both the Russian and Ukrainian economies, and that even the saber-rattling and prospect of such conflict is already having an impact on business and investment. We don't see any grounds for statements about a full-scale offensive in our country, said Danilov, the chief secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. In an interview with the BBC, Danilov also revealed his exasperation with the media for unreasonably getting up fears and tensions. To test Danilov claims that Western media have been among the loudest voices cheering for war, Mint Press conducted a study of three of the most prominent and influential American outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Together, these three outlets often set the agenda for the rest of the media system and could be said to be a reasonable representation of the corporate media spectrum as a whole. And remember, these are owned by the American oligarchs, the American owning class, right? Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Using the search term Ukraine and the Factiva Global News database, all opinion pieces on the conflict published in the previous 3 weeks, this is January 7th through January 28th, were read and studied. This gave a sample of 91 articles in total, 15 in the Times, 49 in the Post, and 27 in the Journal. And now again, 49 in the one that is owned by Jeff Bezos. For full information and coding, see the attached viewable spreadsheet, and you can link there. I like that they do that, right? So here's the major newspaper stance on Russia conflict. Hawkish voices trying to encourage war. Look at this, the blue. Orange saying don't encourage war, right? No. So what McLeod says is overall the tone from the three newspaper studies was exceedingly hawkish, with around 90% of the columns expressing a get tough message. There was little to no variation among the outlets in their tone. Putin aims beyond Ukraine. Checking him right now is crucial, ran the headline of former General Wesley Clark's Washington Post article. Columnist Max Boot claimed that Putin definitely wants to resurrect the Soviet Empire. Boot's colleague, and people believe this. I've had liberals tell me, Putin said he wants to rebuild the USSR. And I was like, can you show me where he said that? I don't know where they're getting this from. They really, really believe this. Yeah. Boot's colleague at the Post launched a bitter attack on Biden for not being hawkish enough. They denounced the American left for focusing on non-existent U.S. imperialism when it should be uniting with Washington to combat imperialism. The only place it exists anymore, Russia and China. It's him being funny. The little pushback to the incessant drumbeats for war came from voices such as Peter Beinart in the Times, Katrina vanden Heuvel in the Post, or from far more isolationist conservative voices. But these were few and far between. I know, promises, call to moves. There was essentially complete unanimity in presenting Russia and not NATO as the aggressor, with 87 of the 91 articles presenting the issue as such. 4 articles did not identify any entity as an aggressor. There was overwhelming support for sending in both huge quantities of what the Biden administration had termed lethal aid, weapons, and also deploying American troops in the region, a move that would rapidly escalate the threat of terminal nuclear war. As Bret Stephens wrote in the Times, the best short-term response to Putin's threat is the one that Biden administration is at last beginning to consider. Permanent deployment in large numbers of U.S. forces to frontline NATO states from Estonia to Romania. Arms shipments to Kiev, which are so far being measured in pounds, not tons, need to become a full-scale airlift. So this is what the media was saying about this. They were like, go to war! Fucking kill the Russians! Let's go! These are American media at its finest. So, and this is what feeds Americans' understanding of the situation in Russia. The Post went much further, with one column demanding that the U.S. send 85,000 soldiers to the region immediately, a figure that it said must be matched by other NATO members as well. So remember, this is before Russia has declared war. They are looking at United States media going, yes, send 85,000 soldiers there. Let's fucking take them out. Like, oh, okay. And what's the Russian media saying? They're saying, we're not trying to have conflict with you. Like, can we talk at this time? Right? So, again, you don't have to be obsessed with Russia to look at the situation and be like, oh, shit. Like, I don't know what Russia was supposed to do in this scenario. Right? Okay. Hold on. I just realized I don't have my charger for my computer, and my computer's dying. Bear with me for 1 second. I'll be right back, okay? Okay, I'm back. Sorry. Truckee spandex. I love chat. All right, let's get into it. So the Wall Street Journal went furthest of all, calling for the U.S. to be turned into a global military state in order to fight 2 world wars at once. With more than a hint of delight, columnist Walter Russell Mead claimed military budgets will have to grow as the U.S. increases its capacity against both Russia and China. This guy wanted to send us to war with Russia and China. Can you imagine? Think about how we're doing in Iran. The fantasies of withdrawing from some regions to focus on others will have to be set aside. Europe, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America all require more American and allied focus and attention, even as we continue to gear up in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. will have to spend less time inspecting the moral shortcomings of potential allies and more time thinking about how it can deepen its relationships with them. Here we've got some tweets. A sitting U.S. senator said on live TV today that the use of first strike nukes wasn't off the table, and I'm not sure why more people aren't freaking out about that. This is what, literally the United States was like, a senator from the USA was like, we could just nuke Russia before the war even started, okay? Yeah, imagine losing 2 wars at once. Major newspapers stance on U.S. troop deployment. Send the troops. Look at all of these. That's blue. So a long history and a broken promise. Context, it is said, is everything. The U.S. government's view that the situation in Russia is a perennially destabilizing influence. Putin, who has previously stated that Ukraine is not a country, has funded separatist groups in the Donbas region, illegally annexed Crimea, and bombards Ukraine with propaganda on a daily basis. From a war in Georgia to sending troops into Kazakhstan to quell a recent uprising, Russia is fighting a rearguard action to prevent the spread of democracy. It has also taken a confrontational stance to the U.S., hacking the 2016 and 2020 elections to help its preferred candidate, right? So the world views and understands Russia. I would say that annexing Crimea might have been like technically, I don't know if it was technically legal or not, but I think it was morally justifiable because the people in Crimea overwhelmingly wanted that, right? So, however, many Russians would dispute these claims and begin the story in the 9th century when the Kievan Rus Federation, a nation whose capital was Kiev and from where the word Russia comes from, fast forward 1,000 years, and the broken promises made by the U.S. government to the USSR also figure prominently. The first Bush administration, as well as the governments of West Germany and Great Britain, all assured Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would never expand 1 inch to the east of Germany. This, of course, proved a promise made to be broken, and the anti-Russian military alliance has advanced across Eastern Europe, now including 3 former Soviet republics that border Russia. The U.S. has been extremely active in Ukraine's domestic affairs, as Russian-American journalist Yasha Levine has highlighted, forcing the government to hike gas prices and raise taxes on alcohol and cigarettes. It has also bankrolled NGOs and local media outlets, threatened to jail Ukrainian oligarchs if further American demands were not met. Washington's role in the 2013-2014 Maidan Revolution is the clearest example of American interference. Trying to play the 2 blocs off against each other, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych negotiated with both the European Union and Russia on trade deals at the same time. In the end, he chose the superior Russian offer. Instead of accepting the deal, however, the West immediately began organizing a coup, funding and supporting street protests across the country. Senior U.S. officials like Senator John McCain and Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland flew to Ukraine to lead the demonstrations, the latter even famously handing out cookies to protesters in Independence Square in Kiev. Yanukovych was eventually overthrown in February of 2014. That the Maidan affair was organized, at least in part by the U.S., is not in doubt. Indeed, leaked audio of Nuland talking with U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt shows that the Washington effectively handpicked Ukraine's next government. I don't think Klitsch should go into government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea, Nuland can be heard saying, referring to the boxer-turned-politician Vitaly Klitschko. I think Arseniy Yatsenyuk, is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience, she continued. The two also discussed plans for implementing the new administration. Sure enough, less than 1 month after the audio leaked, Yatsenyuk became the next prime minister. Since 2014, the Ukrainian government has pursued a campaign of privatization as well as entering into deals with the EU that Yanukovych previously rejected. It has also aggressively purged the Russian language from schools and media, jailed opposition politicians, and shut down media outlets opposing it. Around 1/3 of Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language. This context was barely referenced in 3 newspapers, but when it was usually described in glowing terms. The Washington Post claimed that the Ukraine-Russia trade deal amounted to a Russian invasion of Ukraine and was simply Putin's effort to bribe Ukraine with an offer of $15 billion in loans and lower prices for gas. The Wall Street Journal defamed Yanukovych as merely Putin's puppet. Meanwhile, the New York Times cheered on what it approvingly called the process of Ukrainization, as the Russian language is being pushed out of schools and Russian television out of the media space. The Times currently accuses China of doing something very similar in the western province of Xinjiang, denouncing the process as genocide. Not seeing fascism where it is and seeing it where it is not. This is Azov Battalion, marking Fatherland Defender Day in Kiev, October 14, 2016. The Maidan Revolution's muscle is provided by far-right paramilitaries like the infamous Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi militia that has now been incorporated into the Ukrainian military. The U.S. government channeled huge amounts of money and resources into these groups, with fascist leaders like Ole Tyahnybok sharing a stage with McCain and Nuland. Nuland's leaked audio makes clear that she held some influence over Tyahnybok and his forces. Since at least 2015, the CIA has been directly training fascist militias inside of the country. Today, Ukraine has openly Nazi elements within its government, which has passed laws designating World War II-era fascist Ukrainian death squads that perpetrated the Holocaust as heroes and freedom fighters. Every January 1st in Kiev, there's a large torchlight march to honor the Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera, with chants of Jews out being very common. That was my chat today over on TikTok. Wow. There are now hundreds of monuments to fascist collaborators all over the country. Always with the torches. For 2 years in a row now, Ukraine and the United States have been the only countries to vote against resolutions combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism. The U.S. government calls the resolutions Russian disinformation. The 3 newspapers studied solved the problem of Ukraine's troubling fascist links by simply not mentioning them. Even in articles where reporters appeared to be embedded within the Ukrainian military, a hotbed of far-right organizing, only in one article of the sample of 91, a calm and thoughtful Washington Post op-ed by alternative media journalist Branko Marcetic was mentioned at all. And judging by the comment section underneath it, his thoughts were received with a little short of rage from the Post's leadership. Boot, an infamously hawkish columnist, might have obliquely referenced these bothersome facts when he wrote that, in Putin's telling, nefarious foreign powers, radicals, and neo-Nazis pursuing anti-Russia project have sought to lure Ukrainians from their rightful place under Moscow's wing, but immediately brushed this off as incessant regime propaganda. Apart from that, there was no mention of the far right. On the contrary, the Ukrainian government was largely portrayed as laudable, a fledgling democracy fighting for survival. And this is really how liberals think about this today. That is not to say there were no mentions of Nazis. In fact, the press is full of them. Over 10% of the articles studied directly or indirectly compare Putin to Hitler. For example, the Washington Post editorial board began their January 8th editorial on Ukraine thus: a brutal dictator, having staked a claim to power based on conspiracy theories and promises of imperial restoration, rebuilds his military. He begins threatening to seize his neighbor's territory, blames democracies for the crisis, and vans that to solve it they must rewrite the rules of international politics and redraw the map to suit him. The democracies agree to peace talks, hoping as they must to avoid war without unduly rewarding aggression. What happened next at Munich in 1938 is a matter of history. Britain and France traded a piece of Czechoslovakia to Adolf Hitler's Germany in return for his false pledge not to make war. It continued throughout to hammer home the idea that Putin equal Hitler. Editorials are supposed to represent the collective wisdom of the senior staff and set the tone for the rest of the reporting team and across the wider media landscape. Thus, the editorial board were making their feelings about what sort of coverage was required very clear. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both regularly warned against the appeasement of Putin, a term usually reserved for the period of Western soft collaboration with Hitler's regime before they changed track and opposed it. Earlier this week, the Times claimed that the world was holding its breath, waiting for Vladimir Putin to bite off a slice of Ukraine, the way another revanchist European dictator once took a slice of Czechoslovakia, another reference to Hitler. The message conveyed was simple: this is a repeat of World War II. While Putin could reasonably be called many things, Hitler incarnate is a stretch to credulity. Unable to introduce relevant context that would deviate from this line, however, the armchair generals demanding war took to psychoanalyzing the Russian leader, as well as throwing all manner of insults his way. In just 3 weeks sample, Putin was declared an evil dictator, a thug, a KGB sociopath, and a pathetic throwback. Longtime Times columnist Thomas Friedman, in his unique style, described him as America's ex-boyfriend from hell. Continuing, Putin is a one-man psychodrama with a giant inferiority complex towards America that leaves him always stalking the world with a chip on his shoulder so big it's amazing he can fit through any door. Yet for all the psychoanalysis, it was Western pundits who appeared to be in their own heads and were obsessed with the supposed need to look tough in front of Putin. Citing South Carolina Congressman Joe Wilson, the Post declared that weakness is provocative. Vladimir Putin does not think like we do, warned hawkish former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, going on to assert that Putin saw destroying America and the global order as his sacred destiny. He never said any of that. Putin's allegations that Ukraine was being groomed to join a hostile military alliance was met with contempt and derision in Western media. None of the fears that Kremlin's propaganda play on have any foundation in reality. No one was seriously contemplating NATO membership for Ukraine or Georgia. Plans for U.S. missiles in eastern Ukraine targeting Russia are pure fantasy, a Post-opinion piece informed its readers last week, its editorial board then adding, the entire crisis has been manufactured by Putin as part of his long-range effort to thwart the democratic development and growing Western orientation of Ukraine and restore Russian hegemony over the former Soviet Empire. It has nothing to do with expansion by NATO, whose funding treaty authorizes only defensive military action. And again, they just say this shit. Then there's no proof of any of this. This is just this guy's vibes. He's just going on vibes, right? So readers in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Somalia, or Libya might be having differing ideas about whether NATO has been used purely defensively. Yet at the same time is categorically denying Ukraine would join NATO. The article's study dismissed Putin's core request that the alliance simply put in writing that the alliance simply put that in writing as silly, extravagant, unrealistic, and a non-starter. Something that is hard to understand if this was all that was needed to avert World War III. In reality, NATO was indeed looking to admit both Ukraine and Georgia, having promised to both countries they would do so as far back as 2008. Last week, Washington Post columnist Daniel Drezner proclaimed that Putin has succeeded in creating his worst strategic outcome, unifying NATO. Yet this seems wishful thinking. Germany and France, the most powerful nations in Western Europe, have both openly expressed reluctance to escalate the situation. The German government did not allow British warplanes carrying weapons to Ukraine to pass over its airspace, and it blocked shipments of German-made arms from the Baltic states to Ukraine. Even more significantly, K. Achim Solmbach, Vice Admiral of the German Navy, publicly condemned what he saw as a reckless buildup of tensions. Solmbach stated that the West was refusing to give Putin even a modicum of respect, and that we should accept the Crimea annexation as a fait accompli. For this outburst, he was forced to resign. Across the border in France, Emmanuel Macron was so alarmed by the US-UK push to escalate tensions that he called on the EU to start its own negotiations with Russia, negotiations that exclude the US and UK. Germany and France were written off as appeasers by a dictator by the Washington Post, and as puppets of Putin and Chinese Premier Xi Jinping by the Wall Street Journal. Much of the EU's reluctance to get behind an American-led war on Russia is attributable to their energy dependence on Moscow. Currently, Russia supplies nearly half of the EU's gas and 1/4 of its oil. This is likely only to increase with the imminent completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which runs undersea from Russia's Baltic coast directly to northern Germany. The United States has repeatedly demanded Europe cancel this project, insisting that Europe service its energy needs from Middle Eastern dictatorships under U.S. control or directly from the U.S., at around 4 times the price of Russian gas. The U.S. is currently considering placing sanctions on German companies involved in Nord Stream 2. If Biden can't stand up to Germany, how can he stand up to Putin? Asked one Washington Post columnist last week, the same article demanding that Germany be punished with the removal of U.S. troops from its territories. Why should Germany continue to be rewarded with the economic benefit of U.S. bases? The writer asked, framing the American occupation in a light that some readers might not share. Neurowright says, if one looks globally, Russia is doing more anti-imperialism and anti-fascism than during the post-Stalin period of the USSR, or at least comparable, which most Westerners completely ignore or deny. It's true. They are doing quite a bit, right? But you see how these, like when we think about this, like why did Jeff Bezos buy the Washington Post? This is what I always tell people. Jeff Bezos is a businessman. Newspapers lose money. They're not profitable. They're shuttering their doors, their windows, like they're closing up for business. Newspapers are a hard industry right now. Why would a businessman buy the Washington Post if it loses money? It's because he wants to be able to publish op-eds like this. Because he wants to be able to control public narrative in a way that makes him money, right? I want to go to Transnistria. Meanwhile, the climate change skeptic board of the Wall Street Journal took the opportunity to assert that Russia had infiltrated the European environmental movement, convincing the movement to take up stupid positions like being against fracking or coal plants. Very, very interesting. So Russia, they're saying, convinced the European environmental movement to oppose fracking. And they're like, can you believe it? Can you believe that Russia would do that? This was, they claimed, all part of a successful effort to keep Europe dependent on Russian gas. Same reason he was in Twitch, even if he loses money. Exactly. Bezos wants to own the propaganda machine. Yep, exactly. Democracy dies in darkness, and it's just Jeff Bezos choking it out. Yep. Uh-huh. I'm gonna level with you, chat. I don't know a lot about fracking. I don't know how evil it is or is not compared to traditional methods of extracting oil from the planet. I don't have enough knowledge on that. But I do know that it doesn't seem shocking that somebody concerned about environmentalism would be concerned about fracking. I know enough to know that that's not a leap. That if somebody's like, we care about the environment, somebody else would be like, we should discuss fracking. I know enough to know that that's a reasonable discussion at the very least, right? 100 stream streak, yay! Yeah, I imagine it's not good, but sometimes things I don't know. I haven't looked into it, so just full disclosure. I have no strong opinions about fracking. I don't know enough about it. I do know, though, I think people concerned about the environment would be reasonably talking about it. That's how much I am certain of. Do the workers have fun? Do it? No, I didn't see any of this. I literally know nothing about fracking. If you ask me what fracking is, I'd be like, far oil? It's oil, but it's further down there? Is that what it is? It's down deeper. It's deeper oil? Deep oil. It's way down there, right? Can anybody explain fracking to me? Natural gas. Oh no. Hold on. Of course I have a bunch of Lenin pulled up. What is fracking? Okay. Alright, this is what the Independent Petroleum Association of America says. Drilling technology used for extracting oil, natural gas, geothermal energy, or water from deep underground. It is far. It's far down there. That's what it is. It's an extreme method of oil and gas extraction. Blasting huge amounts of water mixed with sand and toxic chemicals through rock formations. Okay. I don't know. Extreme extraction. Okay, it's worse than traditional methods of extraction. It's only used because it's getting harder to use the other methods because we're running out of gas. Is that why we're running out of oil? It's like sharding but with oil. Kubashi, it is like sharding but with oil. It's like an oiled douche. Fracking stores for water quality. Okay, got it. Battlestar Galactica. I remember Battlestar Galactica. I can't tell you why I was disappointed by the end of Battlestar Galactica without rooting for anybody who hasn't seen it, but, you know. Okay. Running out of accessible sources. Got it. So, if Russian troop movements are mostly ordinary, not similar to those that had happened before, what explains the media circus? A new policy report was prepared for Biden in March by NATO think tank the Atlantic Council. Titled Biden and Ukraine, A Strategy for the New Administration, it sets out a set of goals for the new president to achieve. Under its key recommendations headline, it outlines a number of actions the Biden government should take. Working with Congress to increase military assistance to Ukraine to $500 million per year, deepen Ukraine's integration with NATO, establish a permanent U.S. military presence in Ukraine, and launch a NATO membership action plan for Ukraine. Stay the course on Nord Stream 2, a strategic approach to sanctions, etc. Compiled by former U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, as well as ex-Deputy Secretary General of NATO, the report's recommendations serve almost as a checklist of everything the U.S. is currently trying to push through. Last week, Congress began rushing through an emergency $500 million weapons bill that would make Ukraine the world's third highest recipient of U.S. arms, rivaled only by Egypt and Israel. The U.S. is sending thousands of troops to Eastern Europe. Its Nord Stream 2 opposition remains as loud as ever. And the Ukrainian government under Zelensky is indeed moving towards the sort of economic shock therapy the Atlantic Council wants to see. All of this might lead a cynic to see the current crisis as little more than an excuse to force through long-held U.S. establishment goals. None of this helps ordinary people living in the country. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki has termed our eastern flank. Ukrainians are concerned with the dire economic situation, which has plunged over half of the country into poverty, the highest rate anywhere in Europe. Inflation and the rising cost of heat and electricity are among the highest concerns among citizens, according to a poll conducted by the U.S. government-sponsored International Republican Institute. The same poll found the country was split on where it wants to head politically. 54% wished to join NATO, 58% the EU, but significant minorities preferred more integration with with Russia. Now remember, this is after the United States had dumped millions and millions and millions of dollars into anti-communist, anti-Russian propaganda, which a lot of people there view as the same, right? So even with us spending millions and millions and millions of dollars over years and years and years to try to get these people to hate Russia, the big, bad, scary number we ended up with was 63% of the population of Ukraine perceiving Russia as a threat, but 51% perceiving the United States to be a threat as well. That was all that our propaganda could buy. And this is a significant shift from 2019 to 2009 to 2022. And, very obviously in 2009, we've looked at this before, but I'll show it again just for the sake of the stream so everybody can see. This is Pew polling from 2009. Influence of Russia in Ukraine, 46% said it was good, only 25% said it was bad. So in 13 years, basically, the United States was able to buy a shift from 46% of the population in Ukraine thinking the influence of Russia was good, to 63% thinking that Russia was a threat. We bought that. We stole this country. We bought this country with propaganda. Huge propaganda campaigns. Meanwhile, in the United States, despite the media saber-rattling, there's limited public appetite for conflict with Russia. Last week, a poll found only 31% of Americans think U.S. troops should be sent to Ukraine, even if Russia launches an invasion. Biden himself has even tried to pour cold water on the flames of the war, claiming that the U.S. would not react to a minor incursion by Russia, a statement that outraged hawks in Washington. War profiteers are clearly expecting increased orders. Last week, Raytheon CEO Greg Hayes confidently said, "I fully expect we're going to see some benefit from the Ukraine crisis." Raytheon and Northrop Grumman stocks are currently approaching all-time highs. Weapons industry-funded media like Politico published content wondering whether the U.S. should, quote, rattle Putin's cage. And journalists at White House press conferences continue to goad the administration into more aggressive posturing. Zelensky himself has chastised Western press for their hyperbolic coverage of the situation. The image that mass media creates is that we have troops on roads, we have mobilization, people are leaving for places. That is not the case. We do not need this panic, he said. Studying the opinion pages of America's three most prestigious outlets suggests that Zelensky is right. Nobody wants war, except for hawkish elements in the national security state and among the press that increasingly does its bidding. All right, so this is right before war broke out. This was the assessment of what was going on there, okay? So what's next is we're going to have a little video. We're not going to be able to watch the full video, but I do recommend you guys watch this video on your own. We've watched some of it before. It's Jeffrey Sachs, The Geopolitics of Peace. And this is Jeffrey Sachs in the EU Parliament. Jeffrey Sachs is a professor who has worked with the EU, with the UN, I believe, as well, talking about this situation. Now, this is from 2025, it says. This is actually 2025? I think it is. Okay. So we're just going to skip ahead and watch a few minutes here and there of this.
We didn't expect that so many people come. We're very pleased about this. And of course, above all, I want to welcome Professor Jeffrey Sachs and his wife, Sonia. Sonia? It's very... I have forgot my things, so it's very difficult to introduce him. He did so many things in life. He's of course the advisor to three secretary generals now. He is professor from Columbia University. He started the Earth Institute, and you correct me afterwards if I'm wrong. And now you're director of the Center for Sustainable Development Solutions. All these things, Sonia. I forgot most of it. There's much more. But I want to say something more personally because I know Jeff for some time, and I know, of course, the international field more than this parliament. I've never met any person who is so well connected internationally than Jeff. So well connected, both in the religious areas, he went to the Vatican, but also in the political areas. Jeff can go anywhere in the world and they will know him. Whether it's
just for anybody who didn't see it in the chat, Malrus pointed out this is true. Jeffrey Sachs actually developed the economic shock doctrine policy of the dismantling of the USSR and converting it to capitalism. So this is a guy who's been very involved in neoliberal politics and economic policy his whole life. And yet he remains, as Mueller says, GOAT. Why? Because after this process, you can tell he became increasingly more and more disillusioned with the West's model of doing business. He's not a communist by any stretch of the imagination, but he came to become, I don't know, kind of disenchanted with the traditional trajectory of politics in the United States and the EU. And you could tell as he got older and further along in his career, he got a lot more no fucks given and just started telling it like he thought he saw it. So his perspective is very interesting. So we are not about to get a communist perspective, okay? We are about to get a politics guy perspective, a geopolitics guy perspective, an econ guy perspective. And his perspective is actually very interesting because of that. Yeah, his analysis is good. He does material analysis, as Virgo says, even without being a communist. And that's why his analysis is interesting and worthwhile. The article before was Alan MacLeod, who's a doctorate of sociology and focuses on geopolitics and propaganda.
It's the Middle East, whether it's in China, whether it's in Moscow, hopefully very soon also again in Kiev, and whether it's in Africa or Latin America. And he has a very long experience. I would say the people he knows are alive or dead because he does this type of job since a very long time. What I think is also, at least from my point of view, so special about Jeff is that he's always remained an advisor.
And again, this is the EU Parliament that they're in right now.
To align with any political party, so he has remained independent, and that, of course, adds to his credibility. And I think that's also the reason, at least for me, and maybe many of you will agree, that he has become a spokesman in economics, sustainable development, environment, and of course in politics. And today, Jeff is probably the person in the world to speak up for peace, everywhere for peace, which is all these things combined. And therefore, I'm very happy that.
Also, as Virgo said, and him writing like the doctrine for the economic switch to shock doctrine style economic policy change doesn't mean he was the architect of the collapse of the USSR. That is an important thing to add in. He's not a communist, right? So he actually believes. You can hear he believes in neoliberal. He believes in liberal capitalism. Maybe some of the neoliberal stuff he doesn't so much. So, that's his economic perspective. But it's not like he did interventionism and was like, we must dismantle the USSR. He's like an econ guy, so he would get basically hired on by government projects to develop these kinds of things, which is interesting. And what he's dedicated a lot of his career to is now lately exposing how so much of the world's influence is the United States irrationally being upset and afraid of communism and Russia, right? So even though he's not a communist, he's like, all of this like fear and obsession with communism is harmful to everybody on the planet, basically. Blind Man Walking says, do you think he now prefers a socialist-oriented market economy? Feels like he's going in that direction. That's just my feelings. I could be wrong. I have speculation similarly, too. I really, really do. It's been interesting. I feel like I speculate wildly about Jeffrey Sachs, and maybe it's irresponsible. But it does seem like he is becoming increasingly disenchanted with capitalism. He's seeing the writing on the walls, and he's not like a full-blown Marxist-Leninist very clearly, but I think he is recognizing that some form of market control is necessary, and that socialism is an answer. He's a numbers guy. He still recognizes material reality to a degree most Western economists do not. Yeah. Unless he says it outright, there's probably no reason to speculate. I agree. Yeah. I can speculate all day long about this guy, but I think his perspective and why it's important is he's a professional in geopolitics, and he is a guy that neoliberal politicians, world leaders usually trust to give them analysis about the world. And so he's going to give analysis that I think is interesting in that regard. So reality keeps having a Marxist bias. I think that's the best sum of this. So yeah, okay, just for that context.
You're here, and very proud also that you followed my.
And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit through this.
And he will talk about.
Very close up for 36 years. After the Maidan, I was asked by the new government to come to Kiev, and I was taken around the Maidan, and I learned a lot of things firsthand. I've been in touch with Russian leaders for more than 30 years. I know the American political leadership close up. Our previous Secretary of Treasury was my macroeconomics teacher 51 years ago, or just to give you an idea. So we were very close friends for a half century. I know all of these people. I just want to say this because what I want to explain in my point of view is not secondhand, it's not ideology, it's what I've seen with my own eyes and experienced during this period. In my understanding of the events that have befallen Europe in many contexts, and I'll include not only the Ukraine crisis, but Serbia, 1999, the wars in the Middle East, including Iraq, Syria, the wars in Africa, including Sudan, Somalia, Libya. These are to a very significant extent that would surprise you, perhaps, and would be denounced about what I'm about to say. These are wars that the United States led and caused. And this has been true for more than 40 years now. What happened, more than 30 years, I should say, to be more precise. The United States came to the view, especially in 1990, 91, and then with the end of the Soviet Union, that the U.S. now ran the world, and that the U.S. did not have to heed anybody's views, red lines, concerns, security viewpoints, or any international obligations, or any UN framework. I'm sorry to put it so plainly, but I do want you to understand. I tried very hard in 1991 to get help for Gorbachev, who I think was the greatest statesman of our modern time. I recently read the archived memo of the National Security Council discussion of my proposal, how they completely dismissed it and laughed it off the table when I said that the United States should help the Soviet Union in financial stabilization and in making its reforms. And the memo documents, including some of my former colleagues at Harvard in particular, saying we will do the minimum that we will do to prevent disaster, but the minimum. It's not our job to help. Quite the contrary, it's not our interest to help. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the view became even more exaggerated. And I can name.
To the people surprised by this, like, why do we like this guy? What are you talking about? Gorbachev was the greatest statesman? As we mentioned, he's not a communist, but as Chat has said, reality tends to be Marxist. And what's very, very fascinating is seeing this man who's been a foot soldier of imperialism, really, as an economist working on behalf of the West, his whole life start to realize in real time and critique the effects of that work. And so I think that's really why so many of us are fascinated by his perspective, even though he's not a Marxist-Leninist. He is a great example of reality keeps being Marxist. So again, you're not, as I said when we started playing him, you're not going to get a Marxist-Leninist out of this guy. If you come here expecting a communist to be talking to the EU Parliament, that's not what you're going to get out of him. But you are going to get a very interesting perspective from a man who's certainly been on a political and economic journey that is grounded in reality. It is a material analysis.
Chapter and verse, but the view was we run the show. Cheney, Wolfowitz, and many other names that you will have come to know literally believed this is now a U.S. world and we will do as we want. We will clean up from the former Soviet Union. We will take out any remaining allies. Countries like Iraq, Syria, and so forth will go. And we've been experiencing this foreign policy for now essentially 33 years. Europe has paid a heavy price for this because Europe has not had any foreign policy during this period that I can figure out. No voice, no unity, no clarity, no European interests, only American loyalty. There were moments where there were disagreements and very, I think, wonderful disagreements, especially in the last time of significance was 2003 in the Iraq War, when France and Germany said we don't support the United States going around the UN Security Council for this war. That war, by the way, was directly concocted by Netanyahu and his colleagues in the U.S. Pentagon. I'm not saying that it was a link or mutuality. I'm saying it was a direct war. That was a war carried out for Israel. It was a war that Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith coordinated with Netanyahu. And that was the last time that Europe had a voice. And I spoke with European leaders then, and they were very clear, and it was quite wonderful. Europe lost its voice entirely after that, but especially in 2008. Now, what happened after 1991 to get to 2008 is that the United States decided that unipolarity meant that NATO would enlarge somewhere from Brussels to Vladivostok, step by step. There would be no end to eastward enlargement of NATO. This would be the U.S. unipolar world. If you play the game of Risk as a child, like I did, this is the U.S. idea, to have the peace on every part of the board. Any place without a U.S. military base is an enemy, basically. Neutrality is a dirty word in the U.S. political lexicon, perhaps the dirtiest word. At least if you're an enemy, we know you're an enemy. If you are neutral, you're subversive, because then you're really against us, because you're not telling us. You're pretending to be neutral. So this was the mindset, and the decision was taken formally in 1994, when President Clinton signed off on NATO enlargement to the east. You will recall that in February 7th, 1991, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker III spoke with Gorbachev. Genscher gave a press conference afterwards where he explained, NATO will not move eastward. We will not take advantage of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. And understand that was in a juridical context, not a casual context. This was the end of World War II being negotiated for German reunification. And an agreement was made that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And it was explicit, and it is in countless documents, and just look up National Security Archive of George Washington University, and you can get dozens of documents. It's a website called What Gorbachev Heard About NATO. Take a look, because everything you're told by the U.S. is a lie about this. But the archives are perfectly clear. So the decision was taken in 1994 to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is a project. This is not one administration or another. This is a U.S. government project that started more than 30 years ago. In 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote The Grand Chessboard. That is not just musings of Mr. Brzezinski. That is the presentation of the decisions of the United States government explained to the public, which is how these books work. And the book describes the eastward.
Okay, so you can really get a sense of what he's saying here. So what his whole position is going to be is that Europe has been weak in the face of the United States, and it has damaged Europe. His position is largely going to be that Europe needs to come together as one, like, federation. Like, if we know balkanization weakens things, that's why we're like, the capitalist places should balkanize, and, like, the socialist places should not, right? He understands that reality, too. So his position is generally going to be the EU needs to come together as one federated entity in a multipolar world and assert its own wants and needs, and challenge the United States for global hegemony, because the United States is a loose cannon full of psychopaths who start wars for no reason and will kill us all, right? That's really his perspective on this. So we'll skip ahead a little bit more and just do a few more. I know he talks slower than we do chat. He is older. But I do think his perspective is very interesting. And then we'll get into, I had allocated maybe 5 more minutes max for this video. And then we'll get into reading some of his writing. So I basically just wanted you to get an introduction to him and understand his perspective. He's talking about neutralizing Russia being the most important thing to the United States, to the West. He talks about Sudan. I mean, it's really interesting. If you want to listen to him, somebody said they had him on in the background while they were cleaning the house. I've done that before, too. I've had him on in the background while I've been doing other things and listened to this whole thing a couple times. I think it is really good, solid analysis, again, not from a Marxist perspective, but, you know, just interesting. So here's where we talk about this. NATO enlargement. I think this is like kind of interesting with Putin. Okay, so we're going to start here.
And again, I know all these people. I used to be a member of the Democratic Party. I now am strictly sworn to be a member of no party, because both are the same anyway, and because this is, the Democrats became complete warmongers over time, and there was not one voice about peace, just like most of your parliamentarians, the same way. So at the end of 1991, Putin put on the table a last effort in 2 security agreement drafts, one with Europe and one with the United States. The U.S. put on the table December 15th, 2021. I had an hour call with Jake Sullivan in the White House begging, Jake, avoid the war. You can avoid the war. All you have to do is say, NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. And he said to me, oh, NATO's not going to enlarge to Ukraine. Don't worry about it. I said, Jake, say it publicly. No, we can't say it publicly. Say, Jake, you're going to have a war over something that isn't even going to happen? He said, don't worry, Jeff, there will be no war. These are not very bright people. I'm telling you, if I can give you my honest view, they're not very bright people. And I've dealt with them for more than 40 years. They talk to themselves. They don't talk to anybody else. They play game theory. In non-cooperative game theory, you don't talk to the other side. You just make your strategy. This is the essence of game theory. It's not negotiation theory. It's not peacemaking theory. It is unilateral, non-cooperative theory, if you know formal game theory. That's what they play. It started at the Rand Corporation. That's what they still play. In 2019, there's a paper by Rand, How Do We Extend Russia? Do you know they wrote a paper, which Biden followed, How do we annoy Russia? That's literally the strategy. How do we annoy Russia? We're trying to provoke it, trying to make it break apart, maybe have regime change, maybe have unrest, maybe have economic crisis. That's what you call your ally. Are you kidding? So I had a long and frustrating phone call with Sullivan. I was standing out in the freezing cold. American officials as, yes, we'll bargain with Mr. Trump and meet him halfway. You know what that will be like? Give me a call afterwards. Please don't have American officials as head of Europe. Have European officials. Please. Have a European foreign policy. You're going to be living with Russia for a long time, so please negotiate with Russia. There are real security issues on the table, but the bombast and the Russophobia is not serving your security at all. It's not serving Ukraine's security at all. It contributed to 1 million casualties in Ukraine from this idiotic American adventure that you signed on to and then became the lead cheerleaders of. It solves nothing. On the Middle East, by the way.
Okay, so we get it. We get his perspective, right? That's all we're going to watch in the video, but I do recommend watching the whole video. Very, very interesting. Right, we've got a guy here who was a company guy, he was a party line guy for the Democratic Party forever, and then was like, oh wait, no, these people are all evil and they want to get us all killed, right? Him verbally shaking the Europeans is good. Yeah, he gives no fucks, he tells it like it is. He's like, do not attach yourselves to the United States. The United States will kill us all. And this is the United States war, don't get it twisted, right? Yeah. I find him interesting. So definitely watch him, but remember, not a Marxist, but still interesting. So now we're going to read a paper he wrote as a follow-up on that. This is 2023. NATO chief admits NATO expansion was key to Russian invasion of Ukraine. The continuing U.S. obsession with NATO enlargement is profoundly irresponsible and hypocritical, and now Ukrainians are paying a terrible price. This is 1 year after the war started. During the disastrous Vietnam War, it was said that U.S. government treated the public like a mushroom farm. Keep it in the dark, feed it with manure. The heroic Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers documenting the unrelenting U.S. government lying about the war in order to protect politicians who would be embarrassed by the truth. A half-century later, during the Ukraine war, the manure is piled even higher. According to the U.S. government and the ever-obsequious New York Times, obsequious, I'm not going to lie to you, Chad, I've never said this word out loud in my life until this minute. The Ukraine war was unprovoked. The Times' favorite adjective to describe the war. Putin, allegedly mistaking himself for Peter the Great, invaded Ukraine to recreate the Russian Empire. Yet last week, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg committed a Washington gaffe, meaning that he accidentally blurted out the truth. In testimony to the EU Parliament, Stoltenberg made clear that it was America's relentless push to enlarge NATO to Ukraine that was the real cause of the war and why it continues today. Here are Stoltenberg's revealing words. The background was that Putin declared in the autumn of 2021 and actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That's what he sent us, and it was a precondition to not invade Ukraine. Of course we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign that promise to never enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure and all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of B or second-class membership. We rejected that. Again, Putin said, why don't you create a different tier of NATO where you just don't keep active missiles pointed at Moscow? You can still be a NATO, just a B tier. And they were like, no. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders, and he got the exact opposite. To repeat, Putin, went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders. When Professor John Mearsheimer, I, and others have said the same, we have been attacked as Putin apologists. The same critics also choose to hide or flatly ignore the dire warnings against NATO enlargement to Ukraine long articulated by many of America's leading diplomats, including the great scholar-statesman George Kennan and the former U.S. ambassadors to Russia Jack Matlock and William Burns. Burns, now CIA director, was U.S. ambassador to Russia in 2008 and author of a memo entitled Niet meets Niet. In that memo, Burns explained to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that the entire Russian political class, not just Putin, was dead set against NATO enlargement. We know only about the memo because it was leaked. Otherwise, we'd be in the dark about it. Why does Russia oppose NATO enlargement? For the simple reason that Russia does not accept the U.S. military on its 2,300-kilometer border with Ukraine in the Black Sea region. Russia does not appreciate the U.S. placement of missiles in Poland and Romania after the U.S. unilaterally abandoned the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Russia also does not welcome the fact that the U.S. engaged in no fewer than 70 regime change operations during the Cold War, and countless more since, including Serbia, Afghanistan, Georgia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Venezuela, and Ukraine. Nor does Russia like the fact that many leading U.S. politicians actively advocate the destruction of Russia under the banner of decolonizing Russia. That would be like Russia calling for the removal of Texas, California, Hawaii, the conquered Indian lands, and much else from the United States. Even Zelensky's team knew that the quest for NATO enlargement meant imminent war with Russia. Arestovich, former advisor to the office of the president of Ukraine under Zelensky, declared that with a 99.9% probability, our prize for joining NATO is a big war with Russia. He claimed that even without NATO enlargement, Russia would eventually try to take Ukraine just many years later. Yet history belies that. Russia's respected Finland's and Austria's neutrality for decades with no dire threats, much less invasions. Moreover, from Ukraine's independence in 1991 until the U.S.-backed overthrow of Ukraine's elected government in 2014, Russia did not show any interest in taking Ukrainian territory. It was only when the U.S. installed a staunchly anti-Russian, pro-NATO regime in February of 2014 that Russia took back Crimea, concerned that its Black Sea naval base in Crimea since 1783 would fall into NATO's hands. Even then, Russia did not demand other territory from Ukraine, only fulfillment of the UN-backed Minsk II agreement, which called for autonomy of the ethnic Russian Donbas, not a Russian claim on the territory. Yet instead of diplomacy, the U.S. armed, trained, and helped organize a huge Ukrainian army to make NATO enlargement a fait accompli. Putin made one last attempt at diplomacy at the end of 2021, tabling a draft U.S.-NATO security agreement to forestall war. The core of the draft agreement was an end of NATO enlargement and removal of U.S. missiles near Russia. Russia's security concerns were valid and the basis for the negotiations. Yet Biden flatly rejected negotiations out of a combination of arrogance, hawkishness, and profound miscalculation. NATO maintained its position that NATO would not negotiate with Russia regarding NATO enlargement, that in effect NATO enlargement was none of Russia's business. It's the anti-Russia military alliance, by the way, none of Russia's business what happens there. The continuing U.S. obsession with NATO enlargement is profoundly irresponsible and hypocritical. The U.S. would object by means of war if needed to being encircled by Russian or Chinese military bases in the Western Hemisphere, a point the U.S. has made since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Yet the U.S. is blind and deaf to the legitimate security concerns of other countries. So yes, Putin went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to Russia's border. Ukraine is being destroyed by U.S. arrogance, proving again Henry Kissinger's adage that to be America's enemy is dangerous, while to be its friend is fatal. The Ukraine war will end when the U.S. acknowledges a simple truth. NATO enlargement to Ukraine means perpetual war and Ukraine's destruction. Ukraine neutrality could have avoided the war and remains the key to peace. The deeper truth is that European security depends on collective security as called for by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, not one-sided NATO demands. Right? Okay. So that's what's going on here. We have the leak here that is linked to of the document that was being discussed that you can look to as well if you click that link from our link list. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is an article by Tad Galen Carpenter. Many predicted NATO expansion would lead to war, and those warnings were ignored. This is by The Guardian. So again, think about this. This is presented as an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. We know that there's been conflict in this region since 2014 when the United States installed an anti-Russian regime in a coup in Ukraine there to provoke and annoy Russia. We know that Russia tried to negotiate now multiple times to avoid going to war, and their only request was not to have NATO missiles on their border pointed at them. And we know that the United States refused it, and that both Ukraine and the United States knew this would lead to war with Russia, right? So that article that we just read from Sachs was 2023. So this was a year after the war started, officially. Now, this article we're looking at is from 2022. We're going back a little bit. Russia's military offensive against Ukraine is an act of aggression that will make already worrisome tensions between NATO and Moscow even more dangerous. Remember, this is the Guardians. This is super lived out. The West's new Cold War with Russia has turned hot. Vladimir Putin bears primary responsibility for this latest development. Okay, that's the lib perspective. But NATO's arrogant, tone-deaf policy towards Russia over the past quarter century deserves a large share as well. Analysts committed to a U.S. foreign policy of realism and restraint have warned for more than a quarter century that continuing to expand the most powerful military alliance in history towards another major power would not end well. The war in Ukraine provides a definite confirmation that it did not. It would be extraordinarily difficult to expand NATO eastward without the actions being viewed by Russia as unfriendly. Even the most modest schemes would bring the alliance to the borders of the old Soviet Union. Some of the more ambitious versions would have the alliance virtually surround the Russian Federation itself. I wrote those words in 1994 in my book, Beyond NATO, Staying Out of Europe's Wars. This is the author of this piece. At a time when expansion proposals merely constituted occasional speculation in foreign policy seminars in New York and Washington. I added that expansion, quote, would constitute a needless provocation of Russia. So this is something that analysts and policymakers have known since the 90s would be a horrible idea that would lead to war with Russia. None of this was unprovoked. What was not publicly known at the time was that Bill Clinton's administration had already made the fateful decision the previous year to push for including some former Warsaw Pact countries into NATO. The administration would soon propose inviting Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary to become members, and U.S. Senate approved adding those countries to the North Atlantic Treaty in 1998. It would be the first of several waves of membership expansion. Even that first stage provoked Russian opposition and anger. In her memoir, Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, concedes that Russian President Boris Yeltsin and his countrymen were strongly opposed to enlargement, seeing it as a strategy for exploiting their vulnerability and moving Europe's dividing line to the east, leaving them isolated. Strobe Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State, similarly described the Russian attitude. Many Russians see NATO as a vestige of the Cold War, inherently directed against their country. They point out that they have disbanded the Warsaw Pact, their military alliance, and ask why the West should not do the same. It's an excellent question, and neither the Clinton administration nor its successors provided even a remotely convincing answer. George Kennan, the intellectual father of America's containment policy during the Cold War, preemptively warned in a May 1998 New York Times interview about what the Senate's ratification of NATO's first round of expansion would set in motion. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War, Kennan stated. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. He was right, but U.S. and NATO leaders proceeded with new rounds of expansion, including the provocative step of adding 3 Baltic republics. These countries not only had been a part of the Soviet Union, but they'd also been a part of Russia's empire during the Tsarist era. That wave of expansion had now NATO perched on the border of the Russian Federation. Moscow's patience with NATO's even more intrusive behavior was wearing thin. The last reasonably friendly warning from Russia that the alliance needed to back off came in March of 2007, when Putin addressed the annual Munich Security Conference. NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders, Putin complained. NATO expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? In his memoir, Duty, Robert M. Gates, who served as the Secretary of Defense in the administrations of both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, stated his belief that the relationship with Russia has been badly mismanaged after George H.W. Bush left office in 1993. Among other missteps, U.S. agreements with the Romanians and Bulgarian governments to rotate troops throughout bases in those countries was a needless provocation. And an implicit rebuke to the younger Bush, Gates asserted that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. That move, he contended, was a case of recklessly ignoring what the Russians considered their own vital national interests. The following year, the Kremlin demonstrated that it had discontent with NATO's continuing incursions into Russia's security zone, and that had moved beyond verbal objections. Moscow exploited a foolish provocation by Georgia's pro-Western government to launch a military offensive that brought Russian troops to the outskirts of the capital. Thereafter, Russia permanently detached 2 secessionist-minded Georgian regions and put them under effective Russian control. Western, especially U.S. leaders, continued to blow through red warning light after red warning light. The Obama administration's shockingly arrogant meddling in Ukraine's internal politics in 2013 and 2014 to help demonstrators overthrow Ukraine's elected pro-Russia president was the single most brazen provocation, and it caused tensions to spike. Moscow immediately responded by seizing and annexing Crimea. A new Cold War was underway with a vengeance. Could the Ukraine crisis have been avoided? Events during the past few months constituted the last chance to avoid a hot war in Eastern Europe. Putin demanded that NATO provide guarantees on several security issues. Specifically, the Kremlin wanted binding assurances that the alliance would reduce the scope of its growing military presence in Eastern Europe and would never offer membership to Ukraine. He backed up those demands with a massive military buildup on Ukraine's borders. The Biden administration's response to Russia's quest for meaningful Western concessions and security guarantees was tepid and evasive. Putin then clearly decided to escalate matters. Washington's attempt to make Ukraine a NATO political and military pawn, even absent the country's formal membership to the alliance, may end up costing the Ukrainian people dearly. History will show that Washington's treatment of Russia in the decades following the demise of the Soviet Union was a policy blunder of epic proportions. It was entirely predictable that NATO expansion would ultimately lead to a tragic, perhaps violent breach of relations with Moscow. Perceptive analysts warned of the likely consequences, but those warnings went unheeded. We are now paying the price for the U.S. foreign policy establishment's myopia and arrogance. Okay, so this guy's from Cato Institute. This is a right-wing think tank. So we've got Jeffrey Sachs, who was a lib before all this stuff happened. We've got this guy who's from the right. He's from the Cato Institute. All of them are like, this was an obvious outcome of NATO expansion and a bad idea. Yeah, hot war is an actual term. So this is, and then we had Alan MacLeod, first and foremost, who was a socialist. So we had a socialist come in saying, hey, this is a bad idea. We had a former liberal coming in who's like, I can't even be a liberal anymore because this was such a bad idea. And we have a conservative coming in going, this is a bad idea. Everybody across the board who knows about the situation in Ukraine is united in understanding that Russia is not acting irrationally here and that all of this could have been avoided. So now we have another article from NBC. And this is, Russia's Ukraine invasion may have been preventable. The U.S. refused to reconsider Ukraine's NATO status as Putin threatened war, and experts say this was a huge mistake. So this is the article going on here. Clinton hails global unity against Putin's threat to democracy. We have a little video here. Would you guys prefer to do a reading or a video? It's libertarian, yeah, right-wing, yeah, libertarian. But that is good reference, because libertarians, while being right-wing, they do often oppose militarism. So that is a good clarifying point. Thank you. Does anybody have any preference on video or article for this NBC thing? We got something submitted. Russia's permanent representative to EU on the continuation of military operations in Ukraine until Zelensky comes to its senses. Article? Okay. 1 for video, 2 for reading. Okay, we'll do article. Video only 2 speed. Okay, let's get into it. The prevailing wisdom in the West is that Russian President Vladimir Putin was never interested in President Joe Biden's diplomatic efforts to avert an invasion of Ukraine. Bent on restoring the might of the Soviet Empire, this narrative goes, the Russian autocrat audaciously invaded Ukraine to fulfill a revanchist desire for some combination of land, power, and glory. And a typical account operating under this framing, Politico described Putin as the steely-eyed strongman who proved immune to traditional tools of diplomacy and deterrence and had been playing Biden all along. This telling suggests that the United States exhausted its diplomatic arsenal and that Russia's horrifying and illegal invasion of Ukraine, which has involved targeting civilian areas and shelling nuclear plants, could never have been prevented. But according to a line of widely overlooked scholarship, forgotten warnings from Western statesmen, and interviews with several experts, including high-level former government officials who oversaw Russian strategy for decades, this narrative is wrong. Many of these analysts argue that the U.S. erred in its efforts to prevent the breakout of war by refusing to offer to retract support for Ukraine to one day join NATO or substantially reconsider its terms of entry. And they argue that Russia's willingness to go to war over Ukraine's NATO status, which is perceived as an existential national security threat and listed as a fundamental part of its rationale for the invasion, was so clear for so long that dropping support for its eventual entry would have averted the invasion. So they say recognizing this possibility does not excuse Moscow's actions, which are heinous, nor does it mean Russia's insistence on regional hegemony is fair or ethical. I'm not sure that they have an insistence on regional hegemony, TBH. Look, you can ask me, do I support Russia's invasion of Ukraine? It's a more complicated question. At what point is militarization necessary? But if you ask me, do I understand Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Yes, I understand it. Do I think it's irrational? No. Do I think it's ethical or moral? I don't know. Right? War is bad. War kills people. But I do see that Russia tried to avoid a war for decades, and it was the West who said no. Right? That is what I see. The fact was that NATO status question was not put on the table as Putin signaled that he was serious about an invasion so plainly that the U.S. government was spelling it out with day-by-day updates. It was an error and potentially a catastrophic one. It may sound cruel to suggest that Ukraine could be barred either temporarily or permanently from entering a military alliance it wants to be in, but what's more cruel is that Ukrainians might be paying with their lives for the United States' reckless flirtation with Ukraine as a future NATO member without ever committing to its defense. Analysts say it's widely known that Ukraine has no prospect of entering NATO for many years, possibly decades, because of its need for major democracy and anti-corruption reforms, and because NATO has no interest in going to war with Russia over Ukraine's Donbas region, where Russia has meddled and backed armed conflict for years. But by dangling the possibility of Ukraine's NATO membership for years and never fulfilling it, NATO created a scenario that emboldened Ukraine to act tough and buck Russia, without any intention of directly defending Ukraine with its firepower if Moscow decided Ukraine had gone too far. So this continues. This is all information we kind of already have. I think what I'm going to do is I'll play the video for you while I take a bathroom break really fast, and I'll be right back. So you guys can watch this while I go, and then we'll get into the next part of this.
Now live is former Secretary of State, First Lady, Senator, presidential nominee Hillary Rodham Clinton. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for making time to be here. I really appreciate you accepting our invitation.
Happy to talk with you tonight.
First, let me just ask you if you think we're asking the right questions here. When you look at this war, when you look at these past 5 days, what do you think is the most important thing for the American people to understand?
I think all of your questions are really important, but I would put a big umbrella over them, Rachel, for the American people, really for citizens of all democracies, that this may at first be somewhat confusing for those who are looking at it from the outside, but make no mistake, this is not just an unprovoked, aggressive invasion by Russia. It is an effort by Putin and those who prop him up and enable him to really wage war on the rule of law and democracy, on freedom. And it's critically important that, as we've seen in the last days, that democratic governments and people rally to support Ukraine in this struggle, because it's also our struggle.
In terms of the Western response, I will not be the first observer to note that the speed and unanimity of the Western world's response has been a surprise. The idea that the Russian sanctions at this point would be multilateral, that even banking sanctions would involve countries like Singapore and Switzerland, of all places, that the Russian central bank would be sanctioned, that countries like Germany, which for very good historical reasons don't send weapons abroad, would be sending weapons directly into Ukraine to help them, that the European Union would be sending in weapons. I think it is a remarkable show of single purpose by the Western world to help. It also feels like, while it simultaneously feels like more than we can imagine, it also feels like not enough.
I did leave you with the devil. 2 of them. 2 devils. I left you with 2 girl bosses. Why are you mad? Why are you mad? Do you hate women? Do you hate women or something? Does chat hate women? You misogynist? Is that why you don't like girl boss slave queens? Wow. I'm canceling you, chat. I'm canceling you, chat. How dare you not love girl boss slave queen Hillary Clinton? War criminal, but girl. Like a war criminal, but a girl. Like if a war criminal was a girl, you know? That's like cool. I think that's so cool. You were before, now we're just a misogynist now. Oops. Me too. That happens. I get accused of being a misogynist on Twitter all the time, and a misandrist, and transphobic. So never forget it, chat. I hate every gender, according to Twitter. Oh, Kamala is your girl boss queen. Yeah, that's true. She did the most damage because she's the most powerful. Right? Mm-hmm. Yes, liberal feminism. We need more lady war criminals. Virgo says this is what chat deserves after not voting for Clara Zetkin for 2 Thursdays in a row. Okay. So this article goes on and it basically talks about more of the same thing. The choice we faced in Ukraine, says George Beebe, a former director of Russia analyst at the CIA, special advisor on Russia to former President Dick Cheney, was whether Russia exercised a veto over NATO enlargement in Ukraine on the negotiating table or the battlefield. We elected to make sure the veto was exercised on the battlefield, hoping that either Putin would stay his hand or that the military operation will fail. But they basically knew. The United States was like, we know this will lead to war. Maybe we'll win the war, though. We'll definitely lose the negotiation, but we might win a war. So let's see how it goes. So the United States really is to blame for this. We goaded Ukraine into this conflict. We had absolutely no regard for the Ukrainian people's lives when we did this, just like we had no regard for their lives when we backed a neo-Nazi far-right fascist coup in their country, right? The United States has done this to Ukraine. We stole that country, and then we destroyed that country, like we do with everything we own, right? We ruined it. So the United States stole Ukraine, and that's really the thing I try to get people to understand. We took that country. We took it. You just read a declassified CIA document confirming there was no election fraud in Venezuela with Maduro and Chavez. Oh, I want to see it. Send it to the chat. So you recall correctly, Biden literally never spoke directly to Putin. I know they talked through the media, but I'm not sure if they also talked outside of the media. That's not something I've confirmed. But I will say Marxist Mar, I knew there was no election fraud because a group I've worked with before did election monitoring in Venezuela. And I was like, who did the election monitoring? And I was like, I've worked with this group. Like, they're the real ones. So moral of the story, USA bad. USA bad. Everybody knew this was going to happen. This was not a surprise. And this definitely could have been avoided. And the United States was like, why would we avoid it? A war is a way better option than getting humiliated in negotiation. So, very interesting. The dangling is incredibly dangerous of NATO membership. This sums up, it's possible that it caused Ukraine to experience the worst of all worlds, not receiving NATO protection and also enduring one of the most aggressive forms of Russian domination possible. Yeah, and the United States did that to them. We did not care. We did not care. We were like, haha. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is what role now did Azov have in the war? We remember Azov, right, from the revolution, from the coup, right, if you will. And now we're at war, where we see, okay, so now Ukraine, Freudian slip, not the United States technically, Ukraine, is at war with Russia. What's Azov doing? Well, March 1st, 2022. Russian President Putin cited the presence of the Azov Regiment, a controversial Ukrainian far-right voluntary military group, as one of the pretexts to invade the Eastern European nation on February 24th, 2022. Putin said that the invasion was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. The Russian president still maintains the military unit, which has been integrated into the national army, is made up of neo-Nazis. I mean, it is. But what I want to say here is that it's not like Russia doesn't also have issues with neo-Nazis, right? If you got a country full of white people, they probably have issues with neo-Nazis. And sometimes people like to bring that up as like a gotcha, where it's like, oh, you know, but look, Russia also has Nazis. Yeah, it's true. But that's not, we dislike Ukraine because they have Nazis, yes, that have been formally absorbed into their fascist right-wing government. The existence of right-wing elements in a country is not the same as them literally having massive amounts of political power in that country. And also, our critiques of Ukraine stand independent from our critiques of Russia. We have our own critiques of Russia, right? We can have critiques of Ukraine and the coup that happened there and the role of the United States in meddling and destabilizing that country without these being contingent upon or directly related to Russia. Liberals can't do that. Liberals are incapable of having any analysis of Ukraine that does not depend materially on what's going on with Russia, which I think is very interesting. And I think that's why they compare it to Palestine, because they are not capable of material analysis to understand that this actually is not a war of imperialist expansion from Russia into Ukraine, but is actually a war of imperialist expansion from the United States to Russia. Because they don't understand that, they position Ukraine the same way in their minds as they position Palestine, where it's like, okay, so they're not perfect, but whatever, we still defend them from the bigger, badder evil. Not realizing that Ukraine is the proxy state of the United States, who is the biggest, baddest evil in this situation. And that they are our fall guy. They're our patsy in the United States. We don't care who lives and dies there. This is actually a proxy war between the United States and Russia, right? And it's the United States imperialist expansion and aggression. We wanted these financial deals, this financial expansion into Ukraine. We wanted to export finance capital into Ukraine. We are the imperialists in Ukraine. Yeah, the Nazis in Russia aren't in the government. They're just deranged citizens like in every country. Yeah, totally. Exactly. Some of them might be in the military, for sure. There's a bunch of Nazis in the U.S. military as well. I think it's a little different than your government going around building 40 statues honoring Nazis and naming street signs after Nazis, right? Like, you could tell me, like, yes, the United States has we have a massive issue with white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Yes, we do. It will feel different to me. It will feel different to me if a new government is elected that starts building statues honoring Hitler. Or new statues honoring Confederate slave owners. It'll be like, oh, this is a more acute issue we're dealing with at the moment, right? Right? That's more acute. And some do that. Some do that. It's not like the United States doesn't have that. We do. And that when that happens, it does become more acute, these issues, right? Okay, Marxist Mar has a Code Pink article about this. Let's see. Really fast. Free Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Code Pink. Declassified CIA document reveals that U.S. accusations of election fraud in Venezuela were false. Interesting. Okay, we'll have to look at that at some point. It would not be very cute. I've always had ads if you're not a subscriber, but usually you guys gift so many subs, I don't think regular people notice it. The people who make the actual stream, usually. Antifa resistance groups in Ukraine? I'm not sure. That's a good question. Do you guys follow, this is a Russian comrade in TikTok. Let me see if I can find her. I like her posts a lot. Let me see if I can find her really fast. I'm looking. Here she is. She is Masha Lenina. Do you guys know about her? I would recommend following her if you want a Russian perspective from a Marxist-Leninist. Her username is Masha Lenina 1917. And this is her. She's a Russian Marxist-Leninist. And yeah. Masha Lenina. Yes. So I would follow this person. And I think they're a good resource to learn about our Russian Marxist-Leninist comrades, what they think, what they got going on. She talks a lot about this stuff. She travels sometimes too, and yeah, she's cool. She's really cool. I like her. So follow everybody. Screenshot if you need. Okay. So getting back into this, the Azov Brigade, which has played a key role in defending Ukraine's territory against Russian forces, has rejected the allegations. Also, this is some interesting wording from Al Jazeera. The Azov Brigade also played a key role in attacking ethnic minorities, Russian ethnic minorities in Luhansk and Donetsk, in Crimea. Its fighters have turned out to be the most effective and popular military units on the war front lines. Nearly a week after the Russian invasion, Ukraine's National Guard tweeted a video showing Azov fighters coating their bullets in pig fat to be used allegedly against Muslim Chechens, allies of Russia deployed in their country. Azov has also been involved in training civilians through military exercises in the run-up to Russia's invasion. Azov is a far-right, all-volunteer infantry military unit whose members, estimated at 900, are ultra-nationalists accused of harboring neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideology. The unit was initially formed as a volunteer group in May of 2014 out of the ultra-nationalist Patriot of Ukraine gang and the neo-Nazi Social National Assembly group. Both groups engaged in xenophobic and neo-Nazi ideals and physically assaulted migrants, the Roma community, and people opposing their views. As a battalion, the group fought on the front lines against pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk, the eastern region of Ukraine. Just before launching the invasion, Putin recognized the independence of two rebel-held regions from Donbas. A few months after recapturing the strategic port city of Mariupol from the Russian-backed separatists, the unit was officially integrated into the National Guard of Ukraine on November 12, 2014, and exalted high praise from then President Petro Poroshenko. "These are our best warriors," he said in an award ceremony in 2014. "Our best volunteers." So they're officially a part, by the time 2022 comes around, of the Ukrainian military, right? Azov soldiers have been hailed as heroes after playing a central role in the 2022 defense of the southernmost city of Mariupol. Moscow, not most, just the southeastern, city of Mariupol. Moscow finally captured the city in May after months of fighting. And so we'll talk about this maybe, but basically there was this one battle that really turned a lot of the average Ukrainians who were undecided in favor of supporting the Nazis in Ukraine, and it was the Battle of Mariupol. The Azov battalion showed up and tried to defend Mariupol from Russia, and they failed. But they fought so much that a lot of the Ukrainians there were like, you know what, fuck it, we support them now, and started going full mask off and just becoming Nazis, neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Average people. It's a very, very interesting thing that happened. Yeah, she's in here now. She got out of bed to come hang out here with us. The unit was led by Beletsky, who served as the leader of both the Patriot of Ukraine and the SNA. The SNA is known to have carried out attacks on minority groups in Ukraine. In 2010, Beletsky said Ukraine's national purpose was to lead the white races of the world in the final crusade, everybody say with me, remember, against Semite-led Untermenschen. Right, yeah, we've heard it. Beletsky was elected to parliament in 2014. He left Azov as elected officials cannot be in the military or police force, and he remained an MP until 2019. The 42-year-old is nicknamed Belyvots, or White Ruler, by his supporters. He established the far-right National Corps Party in October 2016, whose core base is veterans of Azov. The unit received backing from Ukraine's interior minister in 2014, as the government had recognized its own military was too weak to fight off the pro-Russian separatists and relied on paramilitary volunteer forces. These forces were privately funded by oligarchs. We talked about this, you guys will remember, the most known being Igor Kolomoisky, an energy magnate billionaire and then governor of the Dnipro-Petrovska region. In addition to Azov, Kolomoisky funded other volunteer battalions such as Dnipro 1 and Dnipro 2, Aidar, and Donbass. Azov received early funding and assistance from another oligarch, Serhiy Taruta, the billionaire governor of the Donetsk region. In 2015, Andrei Dyachenko, the spokesperson for the regiment at the time, said 10 to 20% of Azov's recruits were Nazis. The unit is denied it adheres to Nazi ideology as a whole, but Nazi symbols such as the swastika and SS regalia are rife on uniforms and bodies of Azov members. So they talk about this, all right. Ukraine is the world's only nation to have a neo-Nazi formation in its armed forces, a correspondent for the US-based magazine The Nation wrote in 2019. Oh, is there an echo still? No, it's just the one. I'm so sorry. Not right now. A 2016 report by the UN Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights accused the Azov Regiment of violating international humanitarian law. Now remember, the OHCHR always reports in West's best interest, so they're reporting this against their own best interest, which means we might take it a little bit more seriously. The report detailed incidents over a period from November 2015 to February 2016 where Azov had embedded their weapons and forces in used civilian buildings, displaced residents after looting civilian properties, and the report also accused the battalion of raping and torturing detainees in the Donbass region. So these are what the Nazis fighting for Ukraine are doing. So in June 2015, both Canada and the US announced their own forces would not support or train the Azov Regiment, citing its neo-Nazi connections, but the following year, the US lifted its ban under pressure from the Pentagon. On June 11, 2024, Washington lifted a ban on providing weapons and training to the Azov Brigade. After a thorough review, they had previously banned sending them weapons, citing neo-Nazi ideology of its founders. But they, in 2014, were like, never mind, we're going to start sending the Nazis weapons again, right? Some people have tried to call for it as a foreign terrorist organization, but it hasn't worked. Facebook in 2016 designated Azov a dangerous organization, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what's going on here. Now, getting into this next story from Yahoo, of all places, CIA-trained Ukrainian paramilitaries may take central role if Russia invades. This is from 2022. The CIA is overseeing a secret intensive training program in the U.S. for elite Ukrainian Special Operations Forces and other intelligence personnel, according to 5 former intelligence and national security officials familiar with the initiative. The program, which started in 2015, is based in an undisclosed facility in the southern U.S., according to some of those officials. I'm going to actually change the order of this. I think this is a better thing to lead with, which I think is interesting. So the CIA-trained forces could soon play a critical role on Ukraine's eastern border, where Russian troops have masked what many fears a preparation for an invasion. The U.S. and Russia started security talks earlier this week in Geneva, but have failed thus far to reach any concrete agreement. While the covert program run by paramilitaries working with the CIA's ground branch, now officially known as Ground Department, was established by the Obama administration after Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014 and expanded under the Trump administration, the Biden administration has further augmented it. So remember I tell you, every U.S. president just yes-ands the guy who came before them? Obama's like, we'll train them. Trump is like, we'll train them more. And Biden is like, let's add more fuel to this fire, right? I found the CIA document. Awesome. On Cato. We'll take a look at this at the end. Very good resource, sure. So by 2015, as part of this expanded anti-Russia effort, CIA ground branch paramilitaries also started traveling to the front in eastern Ukraine to advise their counterparts there, according to half a dozen former officials. So the CIA is training Nazis in the United States to go fight ethnic minorities in Ukraine who want to separate. And the CIA is going out there, too, to help direct operations. The multi-week U.S.-based CIA program has included training on firearms, camouflage techniques, land navigation, tactics like cover and move, intelligence, and other areas, according to former officials. Right? So this is what's going on. So lots of people tell you the CIA didn't train them. That's a conspiracy theory. It's not. We have evidence of this. This is real. Now we've got... The U.S. says a far-right Ukrainian army unit can now get aid. A photo shows training was happening already. And this is from 2024. The Biden administration said it would allow the Azov Brigade, a Ukrainian military unit, to receive U.S. weaponry and training, freeing it from a purported ban imposed in response to concerns that it committed human rights violations and had neo-Nazi ties. A photo posted by the unit itself, however, seems to suggest the U.S. was providing support as far back as December of last year. So even when we weren't supposed to be sending them weapons, we were. We were definitely still sending them weapons. I'm going to kind of clean up the order of operations here as well. Okay. I'm just going to open a few more we want to get through. One second. Okay, so we're collecting all of our notes for the rest of it here. So this article is basically just saying the State Department said this month weapon shipments will now go forward after a law review, but it won't comment on if and when the ban was in effect. So they also talk about here special ops training. Restrictions on U.S. military support may have been in effect when the Azov Brigade's official Telegram channel and X account announced in March that the unit's personnel recently completed an American military training. So we brought Azov, we brought Nazis to the United States to train them. Literally, we brought the Azov Brigade of Nazis to the United States to train them. This course on civil-military cooperation was provided by U.S. Special Operations Command Europe, or SOCEUR, according to the Post. One attached photo shows a captain in Azov being presented with a certificate dated December 2023 by a person with a blurred face and U.S. military fatigues. A second photo shows a group of people in U.S. military apparel holding an American flag next to a group of several dozen others, some of whom are holding a flag with Azov insignia. Right? So we're to assume this is the Azov Brigade in the United States training. Yep. A favorite U.S. national pastime, Caltimus says, bringing Nazis home. Yep. It's like the DPRK training Palestinians, but the evil version. So, this article talks about this a little bit more. We don't have a ton of time, so I think that's the most important stuff to take from that. And Responsible Statecraft also talked about this, the U.S. lifting the ban on neo-Nazi-linked Azov Brigade in Ukraine and starting to work with them again. Let's see what else we've got. Okay. Oh, I have this Time article on here twice. Hold on, I can ignore this. Time. Oh no, I just opened it twice. Okay, that's easy. Alright. So, here we have an article from 2022 as well. One of the many distortions manufactured by Russian President Vladimir Putin to justify Russia's assault on Ukraine, perhaps the most bizarre is his claim that the action was taken to denazify the country and its leadership. In making his case for entering his neighbor's territory with armored tanks and fighter jets, Putin has stated that the move was undertaken to protect people who have been subjected to bullying and genocide, and that Russia will strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. On its face, Putin's smear is absurd, not least because Ukrainian President Zelensky is Jewish and has said that members of his family were killed during World War II. There's also no evidence of recent mass killings or ethnic purges taking place in Ukraine. Again, we saw the evidence of what was happening, and it is correct. There wasn't a lot of evidence of mass killings. There was, however, remember, some evidence. Remember, we saw mass graves, right? Where did we see the mass graves? Mass graves found in the Donbass region. We saw that in the Workers' World article about it. So there is some evidence that people were being slaughtered, right? Mass graves uncovered as retreating neo-Nazis terrorized southeastern Ukraine. Now this is from 2014. So this isn't entirely accurate when this article comes out in 2022 saying there's no evidence. We do have some evidence, actually, of that. Denazification, I know, it's wild. So they, though, go on, this is a very biased article, but they go on to say, even though Putin is engaging in propaganda, it's also true that Ukraine has a genuine Nazi problem, both past and present. Putin's destructive actions, among them the devastation of Jewish communities, make clear that he's lying when he says his goal is to ensure anyone's welfare. I wouldn't say that's necessarily true, though. I think he is trying to ensure Russia's welfare, right? Now, I'm inclined to believe that denazifying Ukraine probably was not the primary goal of Ukraine or of Russia, but NATO expansion was the significant issue. That's my personal belief. That's just my assessment, though. So this article says, important as it is to defend the yellow and blue flag against the Kremlin's brutal aggression, it would be dangerous oversight to deny Ukraine's anti-Semitic history or collaboration with Hitler's Nazis, as well as the latter-day embrace of neo-Nazi factions in some quarters. So even liberals who love Ukraine are like, this is real. So when you encounter people who are like, no, it's Russian propaganda, the Nazi issue. No, it's not. And even people who support Ukraine will tell you it's not Russian propaganda. It is true. On the eve of World War II, Ukraine was home to one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe, with estimates as high as 2.7 million. A remarkable number considering the territory's long record of anti-Semitism and pogroms. By the end, more than half would perish. When German troops took control of Kiev in 1941, they were welcomed by Hail Hitler banners. Soon after, nearly 34,000 Jews, along with Roma and other undesirables, were rounded up and marched to fields outside of the city on the pretext of resettlement, only to be massacred in what came to be known as the Holocaust by bullets. The Babin Yar ravine continued to fill up as a mass grave for 2 years, with as many as 100,000 people murdered there, and it became one of the largest single killing sites of the Holocaust outside of Auschwitz and other death camps. Researchers have noted the role locals played in fulfilling Nazi killing orders at the site. This link's broken, but we've talked about it before. Nowadays, Ukraine counts between 56,000 to 140,000 Jews who enjoy freedoms and protections never imagined by their grandparents. That includes an updated law passed last month criminalizing anti-Semitic acts. Unfortunately, the law was intended to address a pronounced uptick in public displays of bigotry, including swastika-laden vandalism of synagogues and Jewish memorials, eerie marches in Kiev, and other cities that celebrated the Waffen-SS. Ukraine has in recent years erected a glut of statues honoring Ukrainian nationalists whose legacies are tainted by their indisputable record as Nazi proxies. The Forward newspaper catalogs some of these deplorables, including Stepan Bandera, leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, whose followers acted as local militia members for the SS and German army. Ukraine has several dozen monuments and scores of street names glorifying this Nazi collaborator, enough to require 2 separate Wikipedia pages, the Forward wrote. Another frequent honoree is Roman Shukevich, revered as a Ukrainian freedom fighter, but also the leader of a feared Nazi auxiliary police unit that the Forward notes was responsible for the butchering of thousands of Jews and Poles. Statues have been raised for Yaroslav Stetsko, a one-time chair of the OUN, who wrote, "I insist on the extermination of the Jews in Ukraine." All right. Statues. The EU government's building statues of this guy who insists on the extermination of Jews in Ukraine. Far-right groups have also gained political currency in the past decade. Svoboda, whose leader claimed the country was controlled by a Muscovite Jewish mafia, and whose deputy used an anti-Semitic slur to describe Ukrainian-born Jewish actor Mila Kunis. Svoboda has sent several members to Ukraine's parliament, including one who called the Holocaust a bright period in human history, according to Foreign Policy. Just as disturbing, neo-Nazis are part of some of Ukraine's growing ranks of volunteer battalions. So they go on to talk about Azov, etc., etc. And this person who writes this says, "My grandparents had to flee Western Ukraine to escape persecution under the Nazis. It's tragic to see the cycle continue," etc. Okay. So then we have... This is from EU Parliament. National governments and the EU tolerate Azov Brigade fascists tour through Europe. So this is from 2024. This is the EU saying this. Azov Brigade fascists are touring Europe to raise funds and recruit Ukrainian members and volunteers who left for other countries. 4 members of this Nazi military unit, which forms part of the Ukrainian armed forces, have scheduled events in 9 European cities in Poland, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechia, and Lithuania, all over 15 days. I just have to point this out, though, chat. Look at the spreadsheet of who does not miss communism. Czechia, Poland, that's exactly where they're going. These places with massive fascism issues. And Lithuania. Lithuania actually doesn't show up on here, but Lithuania is who invented double genocide theory. So even though it's not most people, they do have a strong holdout of fascists. Double genocide theory, obviously being the mistaken belief that the USSR also killed a bunch of people and they were just as bad as the Nazis or something. That is a lie for anybody who's not sure. That is made up. That's a form of Holocaust denial that was created by fascists in Lithuania. So while the EU has added to its sanction list Russian neo-Nazi armed groups that have been incorporated into the Russian army over the past 2 years, such as Rusik, Ukrainian Nazis are being treated quite differently, with tolerance and even overt support being shown to them. In addition to the support, funding, and equipment for the EU has been providing to Ukraine's Nazi military units, we are also witnessing unacceptable tributes being paid to Nazi collaborators in other EU member states too, such as Estonia. Big surprise, where just a few days ago the government showed tolerance towards a demonstration by a few dozen people dressed in Nazi Wehrmacht uniform. So this is coming out of the EU Parliament. So these people were like, that's a lie, they don't have a Nazi problem. Literally the EU Parliament is publishing documents about it. Come on. Then we have the last resource of our deep dive, is they called Ukraine home, but they faced violence and racism when they tried to flee. For Grace Cass, Ukraine was home. Sure, it could be unwelcoming for a black woman, and she would never get used to its bitterly cold winters, but it's where she had lived for the past 7 years. The 24-year-old from the Democratic Republic of Congo had come to Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv as an engineering student and stayed on, forging a successful career as a makeup artist. She knew its parks and fountains, she learned Russian and some Ukrainian, she made close friends. In a word, she belonged. This was not just a place where I lived. I was making something of my life, Cass says, fighting back tears in the train station of the Polish city of Przemysl on the border with Ukraine. It was Monday evening. She fled Ukraine overnight on February 27th, the 4th day of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. She made it out just in time. A day after leaving Kharkiv in northeast Ukraine, the city was bombarded with Russian rockets that killed dozens of civilians. But when Cass reached Lviv in Ukraine's west near Poland, joining the heaving crowds desperately trying to board trains for safety, she says she encountered hostility from the Ukrainian military, who were dividing people into 2 groups, those who were white and those who were not. Prince Curry says, to Black American liberals' credit, even they were calling out Ukraine's moving funny. Yes, that is true. And black American liberals clocked this immediately, actually. They were like, why are you being weird to black people in Ukraine? You're not letting them on buses. You're not letting them on trains. And they did clock this really immediately. And I'm surprised, but not really, that white liberals didn't listen to them, because they're always like, listen to black voices. They love to uplift black liberal voices. This is something actually black liberals clocked immediately. And white liberals were like, Slava Ukraine. Right? Very, very wild. So lib on lib violence. Big surprise. white liberals just tokenizing black people even in their own political ranks. I remember seeing the segregation of folks fleeing and going, wait a fucking minute, exactly. We entered the train last, Cass says, describing how she and other African women were forced to wait outside as snow was falling while white women and children were allowed to board before them. She believes her gender is the only reason she spared being beaten. Groups of Nepalese, Indian, and Somalian men described to Time how they were kicked and beaten with batons by Ukrainian guards who later begrudgingly allowed them to cross over on foot. Malrish says the point is to say you listen to black voices, not actually listen, right? Later, when Cass's train stopped for 17 hours at the Polish border, she says Ukrainian train guards gave out bread and sausages to passengers, but they passed by Cass and her African friends. By the time it was our turn, they threw us the stale ends of bread, she says. After spending more than a third of her life in Ukraine, she felt left down. It was a traumatic experience. The Crisis Media Center in Lviv did not respond to requests for comment. Ukrainian MP Lysia Veslenko denied Ukrainians were being given preferential treatment. There is no fast track, she tweeted on Monday, describing the reports of maltreatment as fake news. More than 660,000 people have left Ukraine for Europe since the Russian invasion began on February 24th, according to the UN's refugee agency. Fighting-age Ukrainian men have been ordered to stay behind and fight Russia. Up to 4 million more could flee if the situation deteriorates further, the UN says, creating a migrant crisis not seen in Europe since World War II. Poland, Ukraine's largest neighbor after Russia, has received around half of these refugees so far. Tents with foods and medics have sprung up along the border to deal with a massive outflow of people. Though a majority white country, Ukraine has a diverse multi-ethnic population including Tatars, Crimean Tatars, Jews, and Roma, as well as small communities of Black and Asian Ukrainians. In recent decades, the country earned a good reputation among the mostly African and Asian nations who sent some 80,000 of their citizens there to study. And while Ukraine provided them with a relatively comfortable life, many now feel betrayed. Time spoke to several dozen people on the border with Poland who described discrimination by the country that has once welcomed them with open arms. Now safely across the border, refugees of color were also dismayed by the continued preferential treatment for Ukrainians in the official Polish response and from ordinary Poles. Members of the Humanity First Germany NGO were attacked by a group of Polish men told to go back to their country. In recent years, Poland's right-wing government has taken a hard line on asylum seekers trying to enter the EU nation. This culminated in a shutdown with neighboring Belarus over the winter when the Polish army continually pushed back asylum seekers into a forested area in freezing temperatures and over 20 people died. So Poland, very, very weird as well, right? So this is kind of just more and more about the discrimination going on with how people were treated. And one of the last things I want to show is Mariupol newscaster. So this is the last one that's not added to this list, but I think I should add to it how it's going, how it started going in 2022. Ukrainian news anchor quotes, Adolf Eichmann calls for genocide against Russians. A Ukrainian television newscaster went on a fascist rant on national television on March 12, 2022, calling for the massacre of Russian children and the elimination of Russia from the face of the earth. Channel 24 anchor Farudin Sharamfmal made the following statement following the report on the death of his friend, a Ukrainian armed forces member who was killed fighting Russian forces over the weekend. He used the occasion to broadcast a photo of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann over his right shoulder and appeal for the murder of millions of Ukrainian citizens who are also Russian. I know that as a journalist, I have to be objective. I have to be balanced in order to report information with a cold heart. But to tell you the truth, it's very hard to keep going, said Sharamfmal. Especially at a time like this, since in Russia they call us Nazis, fascists, and so on, I'll allow myself to quote Adolf Eichmann, who said that in order to destroy a nation, you must first of all destroy its children. Because by killing their parents, the children will grow up and take revenge. By killing children, they will never grow up, and the nation will disappear. The Ukrainian armed forces cannot destroy Russian children because it is forbidden by the rules of war, and it is also forbidden by various conventions, including the Geneva Convention. But I am not from the armed forces of Ukraine. And when I get the chance to settle things with the Russians, I will be obliged to do it. Since you call me a Nazi, I'll adhere to the doctrine of Adolf Eichmann, and will do everything in my power to ensure that your children never live on this earth. Again, this is Ukrainians who are of Russian ethnicity is who he's talking about here. So that you can feel what it's like when innocent civilians die. So you can feel all the pain and suffering when you say, we didn't start the war, it was all Putin, we didn't want this war. Well, we didn't want it either. You have to understand, it's about the victory of the Ukrainian people. It's not about peace. We need victory. Now we have to slaughter all of your families to do it. I will be the first to do it. Glory to the nation. And let's hope there will not be such a nation as Russia and the Russians on this earth again. Because they are just scum that pollute this land. If Ukrainians have the opportunity, which they are basically doing right now, to destroy, slaughter, kill, to strangle the Muscovites, I hope everyone will do their part and whack at least one Muscovite. This is a World Socialist website. They go on to say, this is nothing short of an appeal for ethnic cleansing. Channel 24 is a Kiev-based station, but is owned by TRX Lux Media. In 2019, its website was ranked 13th out of Ukraine's 25 most visited news outlets. The company is run by Katerina Kitsadova, the wife of the mayor of the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, home to 720,000 people. Tens of thousands of its residents identify as Russian and or use Russian as their primary language. The first half of Sharafimol's rant remains on the station's YouTube channel, but now cuts off before Eichmann is mentioned. The major Western media has no coverage of the incident, which became more widely known because it was reported by the Russian state news service Sputnik and picked up on Twitter. A Nazi SS officer, Eichmann played a major role in managing the logistics of the Holocaust and was later found guilty of war crimes and executed in 1962. Eichmann is today cited in the positive only by neo-Nazis. Sharafimol issued an apology the next day, but this has little weight. What does not call for genocide is a slip of the tongue or in a fit of rage over a deceased friend. His ravings are expression of the political outlook that has gripped a section of the Ukrainian ruling class. The 2014 U.S.-backed coup that removed pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych was carried out with the help of far-right forces, such as Svoboda political party, paramilitary gang right sector. These layers have grown like weeds in Ukraine ever since and have been incorporated into Ukraine's military police apparatus. They form the core of forces like Azov Battalion, whose members wear neo-Nazi emblems on their uniforms and proudly display banners with the image of Ukrainian fascist and mass murderer Stepan Bandera at their marches. The Ukrainian far-right is now being armed to the teeth and trained with billions of dollars in military aid from the U.S. and NATO flooding into the country. The Biden administration announced on Tuesday will send the country another $1 billion. Since the beginning of Russia's invasion, the armed forces of Ukraine and various far-right neo-Nazi elements have taken delight in posting photos of dead Russian soldiers, often accompanied by dehumanizing jokes and exhortations to commit war crimes. In response to the shelling of cities by Russian armed forces, the Facebook account of the commander of Ukraine's special forces announced it would no longer take Russian artillerymen prisoner, but kill them on the spot. The post also threatened that surrendering to Ukraine's special forces would be worse than death, and that captured Russian artillerymen would be cut up like pigs. These posts are an announcement of the intent to commit war crimes, fully aligned with the spirit and content of Sharafimol's appeal. Okay, so I'm going to add actually this into our document really, really fast. Oh, what's going on here? One second, chat. And then we're going to look at the CIA note about Venezuela before we're done. We're running a little late today, sorry. I actually did kind of a lot of my work for yesterday. I was like on a roll, so. Oh, we've got, can you guys see the ban evader? Interesting. Wow. What else? Not even, like, it reminded me of, like a baby boomer's way of being racist. They cannot, but the other mods could. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to, like, organize this for better. Basically, how we want to end this is with, like, an understanding of what's going on, because this is technically the end of our deep dive into Russia-Ukraine, and we'll do a little bit of a discussion after I just clean up this. These are fun because it gets me fun. I mean, they're horrifying, but this gives me the opportunity to basically clean up the resource sheets for people in the future who want to look through them on their own, right? Okay, I got it. It's all done. Ban evader. Okay. So that's it. That is our final day doing a deep dive on Russia, Ukraine. I feel like it's been such a huge journey. Does anybody have any questions or anything they found interesting that they learned from this experience? You don't want to be that band Vader smash. It was wild. What do we think about this? What are our thoughts? By any means necessary asks, what do you think the endgame of the Russian-Ukraine war is from the U.S. perspective? So I have my theory. This is just my theory. My theory is that the United States wants Ukraine to lose problematic territory to Russia. That from our perspective, we started this process of trying to steal Ukraine right back in the day. There was one country that hated us, which was the Russia. And then there was another country that didn't hate us but didn't love us. They were kind of neutral on us, and it was Ukraine. We wanted to steal Ukraine, right? So what did we do? Well, we successfully stole around half of it. So I think to the United States, take the areas that don't love us, who cares, make them part of Russia. And now we have Russia who hates us, slightly bigger, but whatever, still one country that hates us. And we have a smaller Ukraine, sure, but that likes us completely and wants to do a lot of business with us. It's a win for the United States. We went from having a country that hated us and a country that was neutral on us to a country that hates us and a country that loves us. But in order to do that and facilitate that, all the people we couldn't convince with propaganda and lies, we needed to cut off and basically make a new part of Russia. So I think that was our goal. I think our goal was to provoke Russia into war so that the problematic, still anti-American portions of Ukraine would be lost in the war. And then now, the Ukraine that's left is smaller, but more advantageous for us to work with. That's what I think. Links to the YouTube videos, topics Tuesday in the resource site. That's a good idea. What else? Does anybody else have any thoughts? Oh, we got a suspicious user restricted. I'm not sure if you guys can see them. They say, are you getting that Tim Pool money for this pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine coverage? Again, to believe that this is not just a fact, is to believe that all of these people have lied to you, have conspired to lie to you. All of these Western sources that support Ukraine and like Ukraine. You think Guardian's lying to you. You think the EU is lying to you. You think Reuters is lying to you. You think the BBC is lying to you. What you think everybody, right-wing news sources like Responsible Statecraft, left-wing news sources like Black Agenda Report, centrist news sources like Salon, right? You think the literal State Department of the U.S. government's public records, you'd have to think all of that is fake. Like, you have to be a conspiracy theorist to not believe this stuff, right? You know, you really have to be delusional, kooky, to think that this is just Russian propaganda. But that's really the story that they're aggressively pushing in the United States. Donald Trump and Biden, they have the same foreign policy, very, very obviously. What I think is interesting, Ligato says, is how universal this process is. USA funding fascist parties is so common. We see that with the Phalangists and Lebanese forces and other Christian nationalist parties in Lebanon. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We have one playbook, and there's not many plays in it, right? Russia and Ukraine heavily misinterpreted Western media. They often justify Azov's actions while condemning Rusik and Wagner, which they absolutely should be condemned, but Azov should be condemned too. The people of Donbas have the right to fight for their autonomy. I will fully support that as well, yeah. The situation in Kiev is that it's a puppet of Western imperialism, exactly. The true imperial nature of the Russia and Ukraine conflict is of U.S. imperialism in Ukraine. It is not of Russian imperialism. Again, imperialism is the exportation of finance capital. That's not what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, the Wagner thing, too, it's like, to Russia's credit, Wagner famously was not, like, an official part of the Russian military. They were contractors, though, right? And then they tried to literally, like, they got into a conflict with Putin, and they're, like, persona non grata. Remember, we did some stuff where we found out they had to go try to seek protection from the United States because Russia cracked down on them. So, you know, there's that, too. Okay, what resource stock are we doing a deep dive on next? You guys want to do North Korea? We can do North Korea. There have been any other huge-scale Nazi events like the burning of the Trade Union building in 2014 in Ukraine during the 21st century? That's a good question. I'm not really sure. Yeah, we can do North Korea. We'll do that next. We'll do it together next. Gang. Okay. So that's it. That wraps up a long journey we've been on to understand the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Does everybody feel like they understand it? Does everybody feel like they understood what happened there? Like, oh shit, like the United States stole that country. That should be the goal, for you to really understand what occurred, right? Yes, our eyes are open. All right, good. Yeah, we could do a USSR deep dive. That would be interesting. Are there any major takeaways you have from this coverage? My biggest takeaways are Ukraine is a lesson. Elections through propaganda, through running our own candidates, right? It's also a lesson on how we control narratives and spread misinformation. It's a learning opportunity to see how the truth doesn't matter. It's the story you tell, and the hypocrisy. We see so many people running around with Palestine flags and Ukraine flags in their bios. Ukraine gives drone technology to Israel. They give them drone technology that Israel uses in Lebanon and against Palestine. Like, these are allies. Israel provides arms to Ukraine. These are allies. So it also shows that people have not learned the fundamental lesson of Palestine and how to apply it around them, which is very, very challenging. Yeah. So, I think it's a good textbook study in how liberals will end up supporting the far-right MAGA movements of other countries without realizing that's what they're doing. Yeah, seeing the Ukraine, Israel bio flag makes you cringe. To me, I'm like, it's honest. Seeing the Ukraine flag anywhere, I'm just like, this is so disgusting to me, right? Time's got a list of countries that showed up to Rubio's thing. Oh, no. Well, what I think we're going to look at before we end this, just really fast, is the U.S. Summary of Select Intelligence Reporting from 2004 to 2020 on Venezuela's elections, right? So this is what apparently the documents are saying. There was no election fraud in the campaigns that elected Maduro and Chavez. It did not confirm that large-scale electronic fraud was successfully executed in specific Venezuelan elections, with CIA's baseline assessments maintaining that other factors better explained electoral outcomes. So they're basically saying that there was no election monitoring or fraud, and we know that. So here's the document for that. If anybody wants to see that, Laos deep dive would be good. Yeah. Yeah, very, very interesting. Liberals have been having a lot more fascist ideology. Yeah. They don't know, and liberals can be so easily manipulated into supporting fascism because they're lazy, they don't do research, and they care more about looking right than doing right. They want to look good, they don't care about doing good. So anything that's like human rights abuse, they're like, I condemn it, human rights abuse, I condemn it. But that's not a way to understand geopolitics, and that's how you end up siding with the wrong people, bad people, because they know how to manipulate you, right, if you're a liberal. Okay. With that said, chat, I'm going to send you off. Are we doing Virgo or Larry today? Should I check? I'll check TankTube. I'm going to check TankTube. I just like looking at it. It's going to be me, though. It's Rob Rousseau and Larry, but Larry only has 28, so we'll send everybody to Larry today. Yes. Let's go. Let's get in there. Raid. And yeah, it's Juicy's Day with Larry. Juicy's Day. Yeah. And I will see you all back here tomorrow. We will be doing our regularly scheduled programming. We will be talking about current events. I will drink more water. I gotta get to work. It's been a rough day. It's only noon. I'm running a little late. I'm cutting into my lunch hour. Okay. I will see you all tomorrow. Are you ready? Okay, bye.